thanks everyone for coming. I had not considered myself a heretic before. I sort of like it. I do confess that growing up going to Southern Baptist Church, that it never occurred to me one day that I'd be in a sanctuary on a Sunday morning talking about reincarnation. But here we are. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the history of this work at the University of Virginia that has been going on for 50 years. Having to do with children's reports of past life memories. Then I'll go over the features of the cases with you, and then we'll finish up talking about some American cases. So the work began with Ian Stevenson. He came to UVA in 1957 to be chairman of the Department of Psychiatry, and at that point, he was in the middle of a very successful mainstream career. He came to be chairman while he was still in his late 30s. And when he interviewed for the job, he told them that he had an interest in parapsychology, but he had a lot of other interests as well, and nobody really seemed to mind. Then the next year, a journal offered a contest for the best essay on the question of life after death. And Ian submitted what turned out to be the winning essay. What he did, over the years, he had collected write-ups of reports of people with past life memories. These were from newspapers, books, journals, various things. And in this paper, he put them all together. It was 44 cases, and he looked at the patterns in the cases and saw that with the strongest cases, most of them involved kids under the age of 10, and many even 3 years old or younger. At the end of the paper, he said it might be good for somebody to go to see if current cases could be found like these that had been previously published, having no idea that he would be the one to do it. But after that paper was published, he heard about a few cases, and someone offered him a small amount of money to go to India to study them. So by the time of this trip, he had learned about 5 cases, and he went there for a month and found 25 cases. And he got similar results in Sri Lanka. And he realized this thing was much more common than anyone in the West, at least, had any idea. So he got more and more intrigued and started taking trips. This is him in Burma, and a picture doesn't show up so well, but as you can imagine, an American professor shows up in Asian villages and starts asking about past life memories. It tends to draw quite a crowd. And, he would conduct his interviews often with a lot of people around watching. So he got intrigued enough with these cases, he eventually stepped down as chairman to focus on them full-time and spent the bulk of the next 40 years focused on this work. His work was notable for the approach he took. He never assumed that a case was reincarnation. What he was doing was going to investigate to see exactly what had happened, what the child had said, how well it matched the life of somebody who had died, whether he could have learned the information normally. So it's a very careful scientific approach, and that's the approach we still use today. So as I'm giving this talk, I may not say alleged memories or apparent memories, but we certainly consider it an open question as we approach every case. Ian published a lot of books and scientific papers. His first book was 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. And that title is sort of typical of his attitude. He was not making any grand claims. He was just putting out this data and letting people decide for themselves. And he would tell about the cases, sometimes in excruciating detail, and he would cover the strengths and the weaknesses. And this kind of approach did earn respect even in mainstream circles. So this book was reviewed in the American Journal of Psychiatry, which is certainly a top journal. And they wrote, in this series, there are cases recorded in such full detail as to persuade the open mind that reincarnation is a tenable hypothesis to explain them. Dr. Stevenson provides us with much to ponder on. He continued to study cases and publish reports. He published a series of 4 books with cases from different places, India, Sri Lanka, Lebanon and Turkey, Thailand and Burma.
The first of those books was reviewed in a little journal called JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is one of the top medical journals in the world. And the book review editor actually wrote the review and said, in regard to reincarnation, he has painstakingly and unemotionally collected a detailed series of cases from India, cases in which the evidence is difficult to explain on any other grounds. Pretty strong words for JAMA. And after that, after this series, Ian spent years and years working on another book, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And he also worked to get other people involved in this work, because one of the criticisms was that he was the only guy finding these cases, which of course is hardly his fault. But he eventually got an anthropologist, several psychologists interested in the work, and then I came on later at the University of Virginia. Ian continued to work, and he finally retired in 2002. He was well into his 80s at that point, and even after he retired, he took one more trip to India. His wife at one point said she didn't mind him taking the trips to India. She just wished he would stop saying that each one was going to be the last trip. And then he died in 2007, being active almost until the very end. His last paper was published a year before he died, called Half a Career with the Paranormal, which was a wonderful summary of his work. And he finished it with his last published words, which were, "Let no one think that I know the answer. I am still seeking," which I thought was a great way to go out. And now a few of us have continued on with his work. So to tell you a little bit about the cases, these are very young children who spontaneously start talking about past lives. This does not involve hypnotic regression. These are young kids who just come out with this material. And they're not talking about being kings or queens, almost never talking about being famous people. But rather, they're talking about someone who had an ordinary life, who died fairly recently, usually someone in the same country. And when I say recent, the average interval between the death of the previous person and the birth of the child is only 4.5 years. The median interval, meaning half or shorter, half or longer, is only 16 months. So in general, now there are exceptions, and I'm going to tell you one that's 50 years, but in general, it tends to be quite recent lives. Some of them describe being deceased family members, like a grandparent, and I'm going to tell you about one of those. But others describe being strangers in other locations. And if they give enough details, like the name of the location, then people have often gone there and found that, in fact, somebody did live and die whose life matches the statements that the child has made. In that case, we say it's a solved case. If the child talks about a past life, but no one's able to verify that it matches with one specific person, we call it an unsolved case. We have plenty of both kinds in our collection. The solved ones, of course, tend to be the more interesting ones. The one part of the life that is often out of the ordinary is how the previous person died. 70% of the time, the previous person died by unnatural means, meaning accident, murder, suicide, combat. So that certainly seems to be an important factor in our cases, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. To give you an example of one of Ian's cases, this is a little girl from India named Kumkum Verma. This is him and a couple of associates with her on a follow-up trip. She was actually a little girl when he met her. And she was from a village, but she began saying that she had lived in the city of Darbhanga, which was a city of a couple 100,000 people that was 25 miles away. And not just that she lived in Darbhanga, but she named the district of the city where she lived, and it was a district of artisans and craftsmen. Her family certainly didn't know anyone from there, but she told a lot of details about the life of a woman who had lived there. Her aunt wrote down some of her statements, and Ian was able to get a copy of her notes of 18 statements, and he got them translated, and they document that she gave the name of her son in that life, and the fact that he worked with a hammer, her grandson's name, the name of the town where her father lived, and some personal details like the fact that she had an iron safe at her home, that she had a sword hanging near the cot where she slept, and even that she had a pet snake that she fed milk to. So eventually, her father talked to a friend who had an employee from Darbanga, and he was able to locate a woman who had died a few years before, whose life matched all the details that I just gave you. And they were certainly complete strangers to Kumkum's family, and they even remained strangers after the case was solved. Her father went once to meet the previous family, but he never allowed her to go meet them, and he apparently was not proud of the fact that he was a well-to-do landowner. He was apparently not proud of the fact that his daughter was remembering the life of a blacksmith's wife, and there's certainly no reason to think that the family did this as some sort of fraud. Now, as far as the where we find the cases, we've studied over 2,500 of them from all over the world. And I've listed the places where we have studied the most cases, and those are all places with a belief in reincarnation. But cases have been found wherever anyone has looked for them. They've been found on all the continents except Antarctica, where no one has looked. And we are learning about more and more cases in the West. They're certainly harder to find here, and it may be that they're less common, but it's hard to know because in the other places, people will talk about them if a child is making these statements. So in Thailand, we would hit areas where literally we could not ask for directions without learning about another case. Whereas here, if you go to a convenience store and ask for directions, obviously you're not going to be asking about past life memories. And in fact, many of the families, frankly, are embarrassed that their kids are saying these things here because it seems weird. So we've had cases where the parents haven't even told the grandparents about what the children are saying. So who knows how common they are here, that they may well be a lot more common than we think. Now, as far as the various features of the cases go, I mentioned that Ian worked for years on a book, and it was called Reincarnation in Biology. And it involves cases where the child was born with a birthmark or birth defect that matched a wound, usually a fatal wound, on the body of the previous person. And this book, done with Ian's usual thoroughness, it's over 200 such cases, and it's 2,000 pages long. It's a 2-volume set. And I will not go through all 200 cases with you, but I've got to show you a couple of pictures. There's a girl who remembered the life of a man whose fingers were chopped off as he was being murdered. And she was born with her fingers looking like that. And then there's another little boy who's remembered the life of a boy in another village who had lost the fingers of his right hand in a fodder chopping machine. And this boy was born with his fingers looking like that, which is a very unusual birth defect. To tell you about one case in a little more detail, it's a little boy named Chennai who's from Thailand, and he was born with 2 birthmarks. And then when he was 3 years old, he started saying that he'd been a school teacher named Bua Kai, and that he had been shot and killed on the way to school one day. He talked a lot about this life. He begged to be taken to his previous parents. So finally, one day, he and his grandmother got on a bus and went near the place where he said he had lived. They got off of the bus. He led the way to a house where there was an older couple that he seemed to recognize. And in fact, they'd had a son named Buakai Lonak. And well, he had been a school teacher, but also he had apparently been a gangster on the side. And he'd had numerous affairs and had made a lot of enemies. And one day, as he was riding his bike to school, one of them shot and killed him. There was not an autopsy report available, but Ian talked with his widow, who said that the doctor who examined his body told her that her husband had been shot from behind, and he knew this because he had a small round entrance wound on the back of his head and a larger, more irregularly shaped exit wound on the front. And Chennai had been born. I don't know how well these are going to show up, but well, you can see that, a small round birthmark on the back of his head, and then a larger, more irregularly shaped birthmark toward the front. His parents said it was on his forehead when he was born, and then it had migrated back as he had gotten older. In fact, Ian reported he had 18 cases of double birthmarks, ones where the child was born with two birthmarks that matched both the entrance and the exit wounds on the body of the previous person. Now, as if these cases are not strange enough, there's also a type of birthmark case that Ian called experimental birthmarks. And these are ones, there's this practice in several areas in Asia where after somebody dies, a person, usually a family member, will take a substance like some soot or paste and make a mark on the body, say a prayer, make a wish that the individual take the mark with them to the next life so that they can be identified. And Ian studied 20 of these cases. A colleague and I found 18 more. And I'll tell you about one of them. There's a boy that we studied in Thailand who was thought to be his grandmother reborn. And before she died, she said that she wanted to come back as a male so that one day she could have a mistress the way that her husband did. And then after she died, her daughter-in-law took some white paste and made a mark down the back of her neck, just a mark with her finger. And then a year later, her grandson was born, and he had that mark down the back of his neck. And then as he got older, he talked some, not a huge amount, but talked some about the past life as his grandmother. This next little girl, her grandfather died 5 years before she was born. And then after he died, this little girl's aunt made a mental wish and then took some soot from the bottom of a rice pot. And I had one of the villagers just put some on his finger to show what it looked like. Took some soot and marked his right leg above his ankle. And then 5 years later, this little girl was born, and she had that birthmark there. Now, when we saw her, she was only 2.5, and at that point, she hadn't made any clear statements that related to the past life, but of course, she may have as she got older. And then the last of these cases I'm going to tell you about is one that Ian studied. This, unfortunately, is the previous person in this case. This is a young woman in Burma who was born with a congenital heart defect, and then when she was 20, she died during open heart surgery. After she was died, 3 of her classmates volunteered to prepare the body for cremation. They'd heard about bodies being marked, so they took some red lipstick and made marks on the back of her neck. And then a year later, her older sister gave birth to a girl with a birthmark. And, well, it's hard to see, but there's this red area. Now, as Ian pointed out, they picked the worst possible site to mark a body because stork bite birthmarks are fairly common and occasionally persist into early childhood. When he was studying the case, he also noticed that she had a pale white line going down the middle of her chest, sort of from mid-sternum to mid-abdomen, and it looks kind of like a cardiac surgery scar, except it was lower, at least by the time that Ian saw her when she was 4. She had made statements about the previous life. She had, in fact, been asked to be called by the previous person's name. She would call her mom the term for older sister, and other family members, similar kinds of names. When Ian studied the case, he interviewed the young women who had marked the body, and he discovered that one of them had never met the little girl. So unannounced, he takes the woman to the girl's house. They walk in. He says to the girl, "Who is this?" And she immediately says, "Min Min U," which in fact was the name of the woman who had marked the body. Now, along with the birthmarks, of course, are the statements about the past life. And I mentioned that it's young children. The average age when the kids start talking about a past life is 35 months. So it's usually around the time of their 3rd birthday when they start coming out with these statements. And some of them will do it in sort of a detached way, but others show a lot of emotion connected with this material. They may beg to be taken to the previous family. Sometimes they will cry on a daily basis about the people they miss. Some of them will show a lot of anger, particularly if the previous person is murdered. There's one case that I studied in Thailand where a group of young men had gone hunting, and one of them had accidentally shot and killed another one in an accident. And then a few years later, this little boy was born in the same village. And when he was 2, he tried to choke the guy who had accidentally shot the previous person. It tends to be that in the stronger cases, the kids show more emotion. So they seem to be more sort of wrapped up in this material. But even so, a lot of the kids will talk about these things with great intensity 1 minute and then just run off and play the next. Some of the kids seem to have access to this information at any time, but others have to be in the right frame of mind to even talk about it. It's particularly during relaxed times. So like the American families will often say that during a long car ride or after a warm bath, something like that, then the kids will start coming out with this material. And then by the time that they're 6 or 7, the kids typically stop talking about this stuff and then just go on with their lives. And we have thought that they forget all about it, and most of them do, but recently one of our colleagues went back and interviewed adults who had been studied when they were kids, and a surprising number said that they still had some memories, but in general they tend to fade, and certainly the kids stop talking about it and then just go on with their lives. Now, as far as what they talk about, they don't tend to come out with enlightened words of wisdom. They don't tend to be little mystics. Some of them will make some philosophical statements, but what they do more is focus on events and people from near the end of the previous life. So 3/4 of them will talk about how the previous person died, and they will also talk about the people they knew at the end. So if a child is remembering the life of an adult, they'll be much more likely to talk about a spouse or children rather than talk about parents. So it seems as if the memory has just sort of picked up where it left off at the end of the last life. And then about 20% of the kids, most of them don't, but about 20% will talk about events between lives, between the death of the previous person and their birth. Some of them will talk about hanging around the previous family and observing things. Some will talk about the funeral that the previous person had. There's one little girl in Thailand who made a lot of statements, but one of them, she complained that her ashes had been scattered rather than buried the way that she wanted them to be. And it turned out that she had asked to have her ashes buried under the bow tree of the temple complex where she studied, but when her daughter went to bury them, the root system of the tree was so extensive that she couldn't bury them, so she scattered them instead. And then some of the kids will also talk about going to other realms like heaven, and the American kids may use the words heaven. And then some will talk about either being guided to their next parents or even choosing their next parents. And then some will talk about events occurring during the pregnancy. The mode of death thing that I mentioned, this is an area that we have looked at a little bit. With each case, we code it on 200 variables and put it into a database. And it's taking us years and years to get all the old cases coded. We're still working on it. But we've got over 2,000 of them now in the database. So one of the factors that we have looked at is mode of death. And I'll warn you, I'm about to show you a complicated graph, but it's fairly easy to explain. This is a graph where going up and down are the number of cases, and then going across is the age when the previous person died. The green bars at the top are all the natural deaths, and all the other bars are the various kinds of unnatural deaths. So the main point of the slide is that there are a lot of unnatural deaths, but you can also see that it looks like people are dying young. The complicating factor is that people who die unnatural deaths tend to be younger because it's younger people who drive too fast or get in drunken knife fights or whatever. So we can look to see if dying young is an independent factor by pulling out the unnatural death cases and just looking at the natural death ones. Now, this next graph is one I pulled off the internet. It's a typical graph of number of deaths by age when the previous person died. And what you see is this gradually upsloping line as you go older and older, more and more people are dying until finally there's so few people left that it drops off. But for most of the lifespan, there's just this gradually upsloping curve. With our natural death cases, what you see is that the curve actually goes the other direction. And in fact, a quarter of them, the previous person was 15 years old or younger when they died. So there's certainly seems to be something about dying violently or dying young that makes it more likely that a child will later be remembering your life. Now, along with the statements, there are often behaviors that go with them. I've mentioned that a lot of the kids can get emotional, and they will show emotions that are typical for the relationship that the previous person had with various family members. So a little girl may be very deferential toward the previous husband, but very bossy toward the younger siblings of the previous person, even though those younger siblings are much older than the child is. The emotional parts will usually dissipate as the statements fade, but not always. And there's at least one case where the little boy eventually grew up and married the widow of the previous person. She was a little bit older than he was. And phobias. In the unnatural death cases, over 35% of the children will show an intense fear toward the mode of death of the previous person. So, for instance, there was a little girl who, basically from the time she was born, she hated being in water. And it would take 3 adults to hold her down to give her a bath. Then when she got old enough to talk, she described the life of a girl in another village who had drowned in an accident. Likes and dislikes. This, you can tell it's a kid smoking a cigarette. This is not one of our cases, but it could be because, unfortunately, it looks like addictive substances can sometimes continue their allure even across lifetimes. So you will see kids who are trying to sneak cigarettes or even liquor. There was one kid where a neighbor was actually letting him have liquor until the family found out about it and put a stop to it. And then food likes and dislikes. The most obvious example is that Ian found a couple of dozen cases in Burma of children who said that they've been Japanese soldiers who were killed in Burma during World War II. They would often complain about the spicy Burmese food and ask to eat raw fish and that sort of thing instead. And then cross-gender behavior. About 10% of the children will talk about a past life as a member of the opposite sex. And many of those that do will show some gender confusion or gender dysphoria. The case I showed you, the experimental birthmark with the boy with the mark down the back of his neck who was thought to be his grandmother reborn, he said many times how he wanted to be a girl. And he was always dressing up in his mom's clothes and wearing her lipstick and that sort of thing. So we actually published that as a case of gender dysphoria. And sometimes those behaviors will persist all the way into adulthood. Other times it fades as the statements and the memories do, and kids just go on. With all of these behaviors and emotions, that they are evidence of a link to the past life. But they also indicate that it's not just memories that may be able to survive death, but that feelings and emotions seem able to carry on also and then continue on in another life. Now to tell you about some American cases. Once Ian started publishing his work, he would occasionally hear from American parents. And then when we set up our website in 1998, since then we have been hearing from more and more American parents, and we hear from them all the time now. Most of them say that they had no belief in reincarnation before their kids started saying these things, and some of them were quite appalled by the idea of reincarnation. There's one mom I talked to who said she felt like she was committing a sin just to buy a book on reincarnation. But she could not ignore, in that case, she certainly could not ignore the things that her daughter was saying. In the American cases, as a group, they tend to be a little weaker than the best Asian ones. But otherwise, they're very similar. The kids start talking at a very early age. We do have some birthmark cases. We have ones where they include the strong emotions and behaviors of the kids. So it looks like it's the same phenomenon. And the American ones prove that this is not some cultural phenomenon that just takes place in places with a belief in reincarnation, because they take place here in a culture without a general belief and take place in families without a belief in reincarnation. So I decided a few years ago to focus on American cases, even though they are harder to find, for a couple of reasons. One is that they don't have the potential cultural factors that could influence the cases. And two, I felt like if a couple of thousand Asian cases had not persuaded people to take a look at this work, there was no number that would. But I was hoping that the American ones would be harder to ignore, and some of them are quite interesting. One thing that we have done with them is we've done some psychological testing, and these particular numbers don't really matter. But this is an intelligence test at Stanford-Binet. Average in the general population is 100, and these kids score quite well on them, significantly above 100 in all the subtests except actually a memory one, short-term memory. We tested 15 kids. Average in general population is 100. Only one of the 15 had an IQ under 100, and hers was 99. So it looks like these kids tend to be quite intelligent. The other things we looked at dissociation. There's a thing called child dissociation scale, which includes normal dissociation like daydreaming, and then more pathological things like with multiple personality disorder. And with a couple of exceptions, the kids scored very low, meaning they're not showing signs of dissociation. We had parents complete a behavioral checklist, a child behavior checklist. The kids all scored in the normal ranges. So the take-home message is that these kids are normal, ordinary kids, except they tend to be quite bright. To tell you about one of the American cases, there's a little boy named Sam Taylor who died a year and a half after his paternal grandfather died. And then one day when he was about a year and a half old, his dad was changing his diapers, and Sam looked up at him and said, "When I was your age, I used to change your diapers." And his parents thought that was a little odd. They had never thought about reincarnation. In fact, his mom is the daughter of a Southern Baptist minister. But he kept saying these things. He kept saying, "I was Grandpa Augie. I used to be big." And his mom in particular became intrigued by this, so she would ask him questions. And she asked him if he had any brothers or sisters, and he said, "I had a sister. She turned into a fish." And Mom said, "Who turned her into a fish?" And he said, "Some bad guys. She died." Well, it turned out 60 years before, the grandfather's sister had been murdered, and her body had been dumped in the bay and fed to the fishes, as the family said. And Sam's parents felt certain he had never heard about that. He also talked about his wife making milkshakes for him every day at the end of his life. And not just that she made milkshakes, but that she made them in the food processor rather than in the blender. And then when he was 4 and a half, she died. And his dad went out to take care of her belongings and came back with some family photos. And Sam's mom had them spread out on the coffee table one night. And Sam walked over and started pointing to the pictures of his grandfather and saying, "That's me, that's me." And there's one of the grandfather's first car. No one else is in the picture, just a picture of an empty car. And he said, "Hey, that's my car." So to test him, his mom showed him this class photo and said, "All right, show us who you are." And he ran his little finger along the different faces and then stopped at the one of his grandfather and said, "That's me." Now, the last case that I'm going to tell you about is even more amazing. And it's one that you may have heard about because it has gotten some press. It's a little boy named James Leininger. And it's been on TV some. His parents eventually wrote a book about their experiences. He's a little boy who talked about being a pilot who was killed during World War II. And it's believed that that pilot has now been identified. So he's the son of this Christian couple in Louisiana. And Dad in particular is quite opposed to the idea of past lives. In fact, he said he started looking into his son's statements just to prove that there's nothing to them. And in fact, I met them. I spent a weekend talking with the family when James is 12. And even then, Dad would make a lot of biblical references as he's talking about all this. And it seemed that he had really worked to incorporate his family's experiences into his religious belief system. And the case started when James is 22 months old, and Dad took him to a flight museum. And James was fascinated by the World War II plane exhibit to the point they had to keep going back to it, and they ended up spending 3 hours in the museum. So with any of you all who have small children, 3 hours in a museum with a small child can be trying, but it was something that James really enjoyed. And then a couple months later, he started having terrible nightmares where he would be kicking his legs up in the air and screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." He was having these multiple times a week. And after I met with the family, I talked with his aunt, who had spent a lot of time with them. She said you could not believe how horrible these things were to watch, that it really looked like somebody fighting for his life. And then during the day, he would take his toy airplanes and say, "Airplane crash on fire," and he would slam them nose first into the coffee table. He did this over and over and over again. And his parents are apparently very tolerant people because their coffee table, well, you can't really see it, but there are dozens of scratches and dents by him saying, "Airplane crash on fire," bam. So that's what we in child psychiatry refer to as post-traumatic play. And you combine that with these terrible nightmares he's having multiple times a week. He really looked like a traumatized child. But he had not been traumatized in this life, at least. And then his parents were able to have several conversations with him while he was awake, and he could talk about these things. And he said that he had been a pilot and that his plane had crashed on fire, that he had been shot down by the Japanese, and that he had flown a Corsair, a type of plane called a Corsair, which I hadn't heard of. But it was this special plane that was developed during World War II. Now, after this case got some publicity, critics said, well, he just saw a Corsair at the Flight Museum and the name stuck with him. And in fact, the Flight Museum does have a Corsair. His dad said it was not there when they went to the museum. And I looked into it and found that, in fact, Dad was right. The museum had a Corsair. It had crashed at a public air show a year before. And then they didn't get a replacement until 3 years after. So that is not where James learned the word Corsair. He said he flew off of a boat, and his dad asked him the name of the boat, and he said Natoma. Now, I think most of us, if we're going to try to guess the name of a U.S. aircraft carrier, it would be a long time before we said Natoma. And in fact, his dad said, well, that sounds Japanese to me. And James said, no, it was American. So after that conversation, Dad went online and did a search and eventually found that there was the USS Natoma Bay, which was an aircraft carrier. And it's hard to tell, but he printed out the information. And the footer has the date that he printed it out, and it says 8/27/2000. James was born in April of '98. So this documents that by the time he was 28 months old, the word Natoma was part of the case. And it was this sort of nondescript escort carrier that, in fact, was stationed in the Pacific during World War II. Now, his parents would also ask him, his name, who was the little man that he was always talking about. And he would always say me or James, which at the time they didn't make anything of. And then one time they asked him who else was there, and he said Jack Larson. Then when he was 2.5, this is all before he was 2.5. When he was 2.5, his dad bought a book on Iwo Jima that he was intending to give his own father for Christmas. And he was looking through it one Saturday morning when James came in and hopped in his lap, and they were thumbing through it, and they got to a page with a picture of Iwo Jima, and James pointed at it and said, "That's where my plane was shot down." And his dad said, "What?" And James said, "My airplane got shot down there, Daddy." And for his 2.5-year-old to say this completely floored his dad. And then he learned that the Natoma Bay, in fact, had taken part in the Iwo Jima operation. Then when James got old enough to draw, he repeatedly drew pictures of planes and flight scenes. His parents say he drew hundreds of these. And he would always sign them James 3. You might think that was because he was 3 years old, although James, it was good that he could sign his name at that age. But his parents say, no, they asked him about it, and he said, "I'm the third James. I'm James 3. And in fact, he continued to sign them that way even after he turned 4. And his dad pointed out, and I tend to agree, all those dots on the page sort of look like incoming flak that the pilot is having to deal with. So with all this going on, his parents did begin to wonder, was he recalling a past life? So they contacted Carol Bowman, who's a woman who has written a couple of books about past lives. And then ABC News was looking to do a special called Strange Mysteries, which would include several weird phenomena. And they wanted to do a segment on past life memories. They contacted Carol, who then put them in touch with the Leiningers, who agreed to be interviewed for it. At that point, no one knew if there actually was a pilot who matched the details James was giving, but they just knew this kid was saying and doing some strange things. The show actually never aired, but because I was also interviewed for it, ABC sent me a copy of it. And that segment now exists as documentation of James's statements and behaviors, documentation that was made before the pilot was identified. So on it, they talk about him having nightmares of a plane crashing on fire and sinking and being unable to get out. He said he flew a Corsair. He flew off a boat and that he was shot down by the Japanese. One day he said to his mom, "Mama, before I was born, I was a pilot and my airplane got shot in the engine and it crashed in the water and that's how I died." In the narration, they say how James may have been a pilot who died in the Battle of Iwo Jima. And then during the filming, he was talking to the crew about Corsairs, and he said how they always got flat tires. So then ABC interviewed a military historian who explained that Corsairs were known for having very hard landings, so they were always blowing tires. 5 months after that interview, James's dad then went to his first Natoma Bay reunion. And he learned that, in fact, there had been a Jack Larson on the ship. He had been looking for a Jack Larson among the war dead, but in fact, Jack Larson had survived the war and was even still alive. So James's dad went and met him, and he learned that he was on the Natoma Bay during the Iwo Jima operation. And he also learned that there was only one pilot from the ship who had been killed during that operation. That was a 21-year-old young man from Pennsylvania named James Houston. And since he was the only one that was killed from that ship, that means if James was in fact recalling a life, it had to be his life. So what we can do is compare James's statements with James Houston's life. James's parents say that he talked some about life before the war. He reported that his dad had been alcoholic. He talked about his sisters. But we don't have documentation of those statements that was made before Houston was identified. But what I've done here is list all the items that we do have definite documentation that was made before Houston was identified. So James signed his drawings James 3, and Houston was James Jr., which made James Leininger the third James. James said he flew off the Natoma, and Houston was a pilot on the Natoma Bay. James said he flew a Corsair. Houston had flown a Corsair. He was actually flying a different plane when he crashed, but he had flown a Corsair. James said he was shot down by the Japanese, and Houston was shot down by the Japanese. James said he died at Iwo Jima. Houston was the one Natoma Bay pilot who was killed during the Iwo Jima operation. James said my airplane got shot in the engine and crashed in the water, and that's how I died. Eyewitnesses reported that Houston's plane was, quote, hit head-on right on the middle of the engine. James had nightmares of plane crashing and sinking in the water. Houston's plane crashed in the water and quickly sank. And James said that Jack Larson was there, and Jack Larson was a pilot of the plane next to Houston's on the day that he was killed. So what do we make of these cases? I think with cases like this, to my way of thinking, they are too hard to ignore. And they are certainly evidence that consciousness continues on after the physical body dies. But it is worth keeping in mind that these are special cases, and they're special in the sense that intact memories have come through, and they're also special in the sense that the previous person tended to die young or die violently. So, and that the previous person came back very quickly. So it's possible that what we're seeing is simply one very end of the bell curve. And the patterns that we see may not be representative of the normal process. Now, of course, it may be that the rest of us don't necessarily come back here anyway. But even if we do, it may not be that we come back within 16 months or that sort of thing. But obviously, regardless of that, the cases do contribute significant evidence, along with other fields of evidence, that the mainstream materialist view of reality is incorrect. And it challenges us, I think, to take a different view of reality, one that I believe is consistent with quantum theory. And that's a topic of another lecture, but I do want to quote from Max Planck, who's considered the founder of quantum theory. And he said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. I would argue, and I do argue at the end of my book, that quantum theory has shown that the physical world is a creation of consciousness, that consciousness is what is primary, and the physical world grows out of it. If it does, then how does that work? And of course, synchronicity is really a way to try to look at all that. I'll tell you my own synchronicity story, sort of to make a point. When I was wanting to get my first book published, which was something that obviously I wanted very much, I sent out query letters to a number of agents. One of them was a woman, Patricia Vanderloon. What I didn't know was that Patricia had just had a conversation with one of her authors, B. Alan Wallace, who is a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, and he had told her about Ian Stevenson and about our work at UVA. So then she immediately gets my letter, and she's intrigued, so she asks for a book proposal. I send her the proposal. She takes it with her to a lunch that she had scheduled with a friend of hers, Diane Reverend, who's an editor at St. Martin's Press. She takes the proposal with her, gives it to Diane. Diane really likes it. And before I even knew what was happening, I basically had a deal with the publisher. So, you can't just say that I was lucky. But if you think that my wish to have this book published contributed to what happened, then it's interesting to think about how it would do that, because presumably my wish to get a book published didn't cause Alan Wallace to devote years of his life to Tibetan Buddhism or to hire Patricia as an agent. It didn't cause Patricia and Diane to become friends, or for Diane to have an interest in this area, because she had already edited several books on near-death experiences. But somehow the pieces all fit together to create an outcome that was very meaningful for me. And it's the same way with Jung's Golden Scarab story, where presumably the patient's dream didn't create the back life of this beetle that ended up knocking on the window, but the pieces all fit together to create something that was quite meaningful. And our cases, well, I'm messing this up. Our cases seem to suggest that these are separate individuals kind of having a separate individual journey. But what I would argue instead is that the consciousness that each of us has seems to be linked to the consciousnesses that everyone has. And it may, in fact, be that we are all part of the same things, that we are all individual streams of thought, but that we're all coming from one great mind. And if so, then I would say that it's worth keeping in mind that we are certainly all in this together. So on that note, I will stop and thank you for listening.